we've got the injectors replaced on this really low mile Z32. We went ahead and went with factory Nissan injectors, the late style, so what came out of the 95, 96 300ZX twin turbos. So they're the purple top 370cc injector, keeping this car as OE as possible. So we did add the Jim Wolf injector adapters so that we can use the late style injector in the early fuel rail. So we've done that. This thing is purring like a kitten again. And the other thing we're going to be doing is updating the PTU. So again, this was a TSB, it was a recall that Nissan had put out back in 1991. This is the old heatsink Mitsubishi version, the bracket that goes on the timing cover, and you get the sub harness. So the issue with this was that it makes everything so much bulkier. It was really easy because you had the old connectors and it was kind of a plug and play type situation, but over the years, you would get a lot of corrosion that would build up on the male and the female pins of these connectors. And then you also had a lot of ugliness just sitting on top of the radiator hose. So what we're going to do is we're going to get rid of these connectors and we're going to run this directly into the main EFI harness, and essentially all we'll be left with is the new style connectors that'll plug into the PTU. So we're going to go ahead and get going on with that. All right, so we've gone ahead, installed our new style PTU. We've also deleted those sub-harness connectors, so it looks totally clean and factory-like again, and we can make sure that we're not gonna have any misfiring due to that early style Mitsubishi PTU. So injectors are all in. Let's go ahead and get this thing fired up. After we ensure everything is running tip-top, we're gonna go ahead and do a complete timing belt service on this bad boy. So a 120K, essentially, even though it doesn't have 120K, but we're gonna do all the bearings, the seals, the tensioner, all that stuff's gonna get replaced. All right, let's fire it up. And that is a beautiful sound. The VG30 running super sweet, just like the sewing machine that it is. Love the sound of just even a stock VG. Really, really nice. Purrs just like a little kitten. So along with the injectors, we also went ahead and replaced all the fuel hose. We use Nissan fuel hose. That's our favorite go-to. Yes, it's expensive, but it's probably the best fuel hose out there. It is biofuel compatible as well. We've also replaced the fuel pressure regulator, and we've replaced the fuel damper. So these are brand new units, brand new hose. It's got a genuine Nissan fuel filter on it as well. We've gone ahead and replaced the spark plugs. We've used NGK Iridium's 7 heat range, and we're gonna go to our next phase. So we'll get the whole front end of this engine apart so we can do our timing belt and all the other pieces that are in there. Tensioner, idler bearings, cam and crank seals, water pump thermostat. We'll take a look at the upper and lower radiator coolant pipes, make sure that there's no corrosion eating away at the aluminum, the metal bypass tubes that are at the front of the heads. All that stuff's gonna be replaced if it needs to. So we like to go above and beyond. On the front of the head, there's also oil galleys. We'll remove those, clean them up, and get them sealed up so that there's no sweating of oil in the future. In case this thing gets driven later on and just even sitting, you know, oil is gonna go anywhere it can to escape. So we'll get those galley plugs sealed up, and we'll also replace any of the rubber components like the breather hoses are a perfect time to get in there from the intake valve cover towers. All that stuff's way easier to get to with the timing covers off of there. All right, so these are the old early twin turbo injectors that came out of that low mile Z32. We already had resistance checked them, and essentially it's surprising that it ran on 3 cylinders. I could only get good resistance out of 1, so we're gonna go ahead and use our digital multimeter, and we're gonna check. We're gonna set this for our resistance, and it's gonna give us an ohm reading. Again, on a high impedance injector, we are looking for about 12 to 14, right around in there as far as the Nissan stuff goes. Most of your other aftermarket stuff's gonna be right in there as well. So this is a bad one. This one wasn't getting any measurement at all. There were 4 out of the 6 these that actually had no resistance reading whatsoever. This is one of the good ones, the only one that we could get good resistance out of, and you're gonna see that one is right there in spec. So 12.3, really this thing only had one good injector in it. The rest of them were trash. We'll grab another one of the bad ones. And again, I'm just going on the pins, and that one, nothing. So easy way, if you have a misfiring Z32, you can do a resistance check your ohms, and if you're not getting any reading or you're getting really high reading beyond 12 or 14, you know that you're dealing with a bad injector. And these injectors, really common for them to fail. The early style, especially back in the early 2000s, mid 2000s, California was using MTBE. It was the fuel additive they were using before we were introduced to ethanol, and that stuff was really bad, really hard on these early injectors. We used to have to replace sometimes a brand new early style within a matter of a few weeks or months. That's how bad that fuel was. Thankfully, the government found out that it was really bad. It was getting into the groundwater, and it did really bad stuff. So now we're using ethanol. When they did that change, we started getting away from some of these problems. But nonetheless, these things are still problematic. The late style are really good injectors. So Nissan fixed a lot of the issues with the later style injector. All right, so to get started, I know a lot of you guys, the Z32 gurus out there, know how to do a tie and belt job. We're just gonna show a little bit how I do it. What we start with, this is of course on this twin turbo. I've got my little tray and it's got little compartments. I kind of break them up to all the individual pieces of the job and keep them all together so you don't lose anything. Usually just set it on top of the intake manifold. That way when you're taking stuff apart, you can just put all your stuff here. So first thing we're gonna start with, of course, is I've removed the radiator cap, the radiator upper brackets. We're gonna remove the throttle body charge pipes. These will come off. These are still nice and soft and supple. They're in good condition. Again, the car has really low miles. Usually these don't survive a whole lot of time with all that heat under the hood. Once we get these off, we're gonna make sure that we cover these intercooler tubes up, because if you drop something in there, it's gonna spell disaster for your engine. You don't wanna drop a bolt down there, especially if you do remove the outer charge pipes. You could drop a bolt right into the turbo and you can destroy your compressor wheel. So we'll make sure we cover those up. We'll get our radiator out, drain the coolant, of course, remove our upper and our lower radiator hoses, and then we will have the front of the engine at our disposal. Get all the accessory belts off, and then we'll pull the coolant pipes out, and then we can pull the upper covers and then get our crank pulley. So let's get to work. All right, so we've gone ahead, we've loosened up the tension on our water pump alternator belt. Before we did that, we loosened the nuts on the fan clutch to water pump. We removed all the fan blade and the whole assembly with the fan clutch. We've also undone our AC belt. So we have both these belts waiting to come off. We've got to loosen our adjuster, release some of the tension on the power steering belt. And one thing to note is when you are loosening up or adjusting your belt, you gotta make sure that you loosen the actual accessory as well. So like the alternator, you wanna loosen this big 17mm bolt before you actually go to loosen this, because your bolt and your alternator are all tight. It's not gonna wanna swivel. The alternator needs to swivel so you can adjust it. If you force it, you can with a pry bar, but it's not ideal situation. Same thing with the power steering pump. There's a little window to access the 14mm bolt. We're not quite there, so we're gonna use our 27mm socket, 1/2" ratchet. We're gonna rotate the engine a little bit to get us to line up the window to that bolt. We'll loosen that up, and then we can go ahead and loosen up the tension. At that point, the pump will swivel and we can remove our belts. All right, we've got our 27mm socket. I'm gonna rotate this just enough. We'll loosen up the bolt of the power steering pump. What we need to do is just loosen it up a little bit. I'm gonna use my 12mm ratcheting wrench, the swivel head, and then we'll do the rest of it by hand. And then we can go ahead, once all that stuff is loose, you can just pull on the belt and you can get that pump to swivel. So you'll still notice that it's a little tight. And what we end up doing is we just walk the belt off by rotating the engine. Boom, there it is. Our AC belt in the middle, followed by our water pump alternator belt. And there they are. These are actually in really good shape. We'll take a look at them. We'll get them all cleaned up and dried up. So somebody had replaced these in the past. You can see they don't have the OG Nissan logo, the hamburger logo from the 90s. I'm sure they would have been really, really cracked if they were. So this is definitely a newer belt, probably replaced in the last 5 years. All right, so we've got all our belts removed, obviously the fan clutch, our hoses. This is what you're gonna have next. We will now be able to move our coolant hard pipe, so our upper and the lower. The lower is for our thermostat. It's part of the housing assembly. I'm gonna go ahead and get our clamps on the bypass portion moved back, and we'll start by removing the lower pipe or the thermostat housing pipe. We'll go ahead and start removing that. That one has 2 nuts that are 12 millimeter, and we have a 6 millimeter Allen bolt. So you want to make sure that you get the Allen bolts in all the way and not just part of the way, otherwise you're going to strip them, and then you're going to have a hell of a time trying to get that stuff out. Not fun. I like to give them a little hit just with my bare hand. If somebody else has been in there, they could have munched them up, and you might have to use all right, and then we'll grab our 12s and then we'll pop that out, and then we'll get a bunch of coolant rushing out. All right, we'll go ahead and tug on this bad boy. Only thing that seals it is silicone, so you're breaking that seal. Take our bolt. Look at how nice and clean. Look at that zinc coating from the factory. Look at that. Thing's never been apart before. Really nice. I love to see them like this. So somebody's at least been changing the coolant out it and hasn't allowed it to get too out of hand. So a little bit of corrosion, not bad at all. These can just be cleaned up and reused.